Our speaker this month is Jean Roseman, who's very famous, and I'm sure I don't need to introduce her, but her topic today is Dinah Shore, a dynamic Nashville girl.
So thank you very much. Well, how did she get that far? If you look at this picture, you're going to see some women, essentially women's names and numbers beside them. It all started with 4 sisters. The first sister was Lena. She came from Russian Poland to Nashville, and she married. She married Sam Bittner, who I'm sure how many of you are native Nashvillians or have been around long enough to kind of call yourself that. That was the costume shop, and it's still in business, but it's no longer in the family. It's over there by Montana Ted's on West End. Anyway, she married into that family. Sam Bittner had bought a trunk load of costumes, Tim, from a sideshow, and he was able to kind of expand it with his tailoring background into much more. And I know myself, in times past, I actually bought a Southern plantation dress and had to use Bittner's. So the idea that the mother had put into her head was, you marry a nice man, you find enough money to bring your next sister. So sister number 2 comes. Sister number 2 is Annie, and she marries Saul Shore. Saul Shore comes from a shtetl, a village, also in Russian Poland, and he's a very serious man. And anyway, he helps the family situation expand. The third sister, Frida, comes next, and she marries Morris Levinson. And very last came Ethel. But Ethel, however, did not get enough money for the fare. The family hadn't realized here in America that the fare had gone up dramatically. She gets to the boat and they don't let her on. She's crying. And somebody nearby in a bakery takes pity on her, invites her to work for them for a period of time until she gets the money. She finally gets the money and comes to Nashville and marries Abe Lipschutz. And their amalgamated families of these 4 sisters have grown. In fact, somebody just mentioned to me about working with one of the descendants. Dinah had a number of cousins here in Nashville. And here's a picture of her mother after she arrived. Her mother looks dour in these pictures, unlike what we do today with our iPhones, you know, and so forth, snapping pictures all the time. It was a big deal when they had a picture taken, and she's posed, and she does look very, very dour and not like a fun person. She was a fun person. Unfortunately, her husband wasn't. He was 12 years older. He was very serious. He was very inclined not to spend money, and it was always an ill-suited match for the two of them. And where did they go to live? They went to live in Winchester, Tennessee. And as you can imagine, they were the only Jewish family in Winchester. Bessie, the older daughter, was 8 years older than Fanny Rose, or Frances Rose, as she was also called. Frances Rose was born on either of 2 dates. One is February 29th, 1916, and the other is March 1st, 1917. And nobody knows because the birth was not recorded. I know I went to the Cordell Hull building and I tried to find it out, figuring maybe after the fact they had submitted a birth certificate. And Dinah liked the February 29th, so I guess for all intents and purposes, we can stick with February 29th. But it makes her a year older, and down the line, when she gets involved with Burt Reynolds, that's another year. But anyway, she's born, and her father is a merchant in the town, operating a dry goods store. They took great pride in being Americans and being a part of the community, and they worked hard to be accepted into the community. there were a lot of imbalances and tensions in the family. It's not my tape recorder, I don't think. And a lot of imbalances in the family. The father's 12 years older than the mother. They're totally different personalities. The mother was an aspiring opera singer. She had a beautiful contralto voice like her daughter eventually had too. She was a sports enthusiast like Dinah eventually became. And she was full of life. She was gregarious. She was happy, lighthearted, vibrant. And she stole away without her husband knowing it to the next town and took voice lessons from a woman there. And her husband found out about it. He was very, very mad. But anyway, at 18 months of age, Fanny Rose was stricken with polio. I'm sure most of you remember that era with polio. Her mother decided not to have the conventional American treatment, which was essentially immobility. She found out about an Australian method called the Sister Kenny method. It involved massage and heat and constant movement of the limb. And her mother did that for 6 years. And she almost had an undetectable limp. Now remember, she mostly wore long dresses on television. I'm sure most of us can remember her from television. But this presented a bit of a problem for Frances Rose. When they talked about her limp, they did it in a whisper, so she felt she was different. And so she tried harder to be accepted. And I think that came out through her career, that she tried very hard to be liked on the stage, on TV, wherever. She always wanted to win love and approval. Her father would put her up on the counter in the store, and she would sing to the customers. Everything seemed fine, but actually it wasn't. One day, there was a parade of Ku Klux Klan men. And of course, they were all hooded and cloaked, and nobody could tell who they were, except Mr. Shore. Anybody got an idea how he could know who was who?
They were drug dealers.
It was their shoes. He had sold them their shoes, and so he knew who they were. He began to get uncomfortable about being there, and so they decided maybe it was time to sell the store and sell the house and move on, which they did. They moved to Nashville. And Nashville often, before I jumped ahead, I'm sorry, here she is at about 3 years of age, and she was always trying to, be the most in any group. Here she is in the center, she's smiling, the other kids aren't, but she definitely was always very inclined to be outgoing and outreaching and so forth. But as she got older, it didn't stop other kids from taunting her a little. Now think about her name. She didn't go by Frances, she went by Fanny. And they would sing this: Fanny sat on a tack, Fanny rose. Fanny Rose sat on a tack. Did Fanny rise? Fanny rose, sure. And so she was different. She knew that. Eventually she added an E to the name. And of course, down the line, we know she changed it. She was chronically underweight, but it didn't stop her from constantly exercising. How many of you remember Cascade Plunge? Anybody? Good, good, good. Or even something else that I think you mostly will remember if you've been here a while, the pool at Centennial Park. You remember that, huh? You swam there?
Yeah, my uncle used to run the place.
Really? Well, do you know why they closed it?
With the integration.
Integration, they would rather have closed the pool and denied the kids the opportunity to swim than to integrate that pool. Well, Fanny Rose would sit on the side of the pool and just sing songs, serenade the swimmers as they swam, and she was very popular among the kids. But her parents at home had lots of problems. They had bought a house on Whitland, and this is the house, it's still there. It was a duplex duplex. And I let something happen. I know now when I want to follow something through, I need to do it at the time. Harry Blum, who was sort of related to everybody in Nashville, lived on the other side of the duplex for many, many years. And he remembers Dinah having a red convertible and singing all the time and playing and so forth. And I kept thinking, I've got to get him to record those stories for me. And then he died. So I didn't get it. I think he was really the last one that I could have approached about being a peer of hers. As I said, the house was a duplex, and it's now owned by a single family. That meant that Dinah went to Ransom and went to Hume Fogg. When she was a senior at Hume Fogg in March, she was sitting, maybe it was February, I have to double check when I get to the next slide. She was sitting in the classroom and a dread came over her, some premonition. And she got up out of class and the teacher said, Frances Rose, sit down. And she walked out of the classroom, torpedoed down the stairs and went to the principal's office and said, I need to call home. She called home, he let her, and that's when she found out her mother was in dire straits, a dire situation health-wise. She had been all right that morning, but later that day she did die of a coronary thrombosis. Dinah ran all the way home from Hume Fogg out to beyond West End Middle School to find that her mother had just died. Changed her life completely. Her mother was her friend and the one who encouraged her to sing and dance and play and be more or less like her, not like her father. As I said, the parents did not get along. They were ideally missuited to each other. Well, Dinah went on to graduate from Hume Fogg, and here she is in her 1934 picture. She was considered most popular girl, and I have to back up and tell you an interesting little story. She was 14 years old when she decided, I'm singing all the time, I ought to gain some money with this. So she got a friend to drive her out to a club called the Pines, and she negotiated a $10 salary to sing that evening for the patrons. And she got the friend to drive her back that evening after she had taken one of her older sister's dresses, and the dress was long. And it was raining that night. She got out of the car and she had no knowledge of how to wear a dress, and she didn't think to pull it up. She just kind of traipsed through the mud. She arrived sopping wet on the floor, on the bottom of the skirt, and she looks and there are her parents. They had caught wind of it, and her father said, you are going to stay in school, you're going to go to Vanderbilt, and you're going to be educated. And that was the end of her singing career there for a while. Well, jump ahead a few years, her father is now her sole parent, that her mother is dead. Her oldest sister, Bessie, who had married Dr. Maurice Seligman, also from Nashville, had a residency in St. Louis, and it was a very good one. He was an internist, and they decided to give up that residency and come back to Nashville and help her father with raising her. She also was a little boy crazy. At 17, she fell in love with the older swimming coach, and they had a plan to run off at the next meet that was in Kentucky. But she told her friends, and it got back to her father, and her father was right there in Kentucky to stop her from getting married at 17. And aren't we glad that that happened? This is, oops, I'm going to hit too far. This is her sister and her husband, Morris Seligman. And as I said, they came back and helped with her. She did go to Vanderbilt, and she was very popular. She was a member of the Glee Club. She belonged to the French and the German and the art clubs. She was president of the student government club. She performed all the time in light musicals, and she was a fencer. She liked fencing, basketball and swimming. She was also taking voice lessons at this point. Bessie had a very positive effect on the father in terms of encouraging Fanny Rose's music career. And she was taking lessons from a man named John Lewis. Now, John Lewis wanted her to make a choice between being a cheerleader and yelling all those cheers or singing and doing, some serious music. And she chose to do the cheerleading. But she came back, and he decided that he was going to set her up for an audition. After he told her how to use a mic, he said, we're going to go over to the radio station where I work, and we're going to show you how to use a mic. He didn't tell her it was for an audition. And she went and she did all right, and WSM hired her to sing on their station. So she developed a style that was centered around this song, the Dinah song, which was very, very popular at that time. So she knew how to sing in front of a microphone. She also was a very good photographer, and her father was fairly indulgent. He bought her a lot of photography equipment, and she was showing her nephew here at this time. This is Bessie's son. She also had a boyfriend at this time who said, you have to memorize the lyrics of your song. You can't stand and read them in front of the microphone. You need to know it. And she really worked on memorizing, and she got very good at memorizing names and conditions under which she met people and so forth. Anyway, she went to New York between her junior and her senior year to audition over her father's objections, but with Bessie's approval. It didn't work out. It was the summer, just didn't work out. She didn't do a good job in the audition, and she didn't get anywhere. So she came back, finished her senior year, graduated in sociology, and sold all of her camera equipment so she could go back to New York over her father's objections. And she got a room at the Barbizon Hotel. And this was a 23-story hotel in Manhattan, which was a refuge, a safe place for women. It had a code of conduct which involved no men about the lobby. Rules were strictly enforced, and women had to enter only if they had gone through a review process. They had to have 3 letters of recommendation. They had to have an interview. They were graded on how they looked, how they dressed, and what how they comported themselves. Such people as Grace Kelly, Candice Bergen, Joan Crawford, Sylvia Plath, Ally McGraw, and more recently, Liza Minnelli were there at this hotel. Anyway, Dinah, I should have said, had a big problem at this point in life. She realized she couldn't handle money at all. Her father had just given her money, or her sister had slipped her money. And so she was on her own now, $273, and she was going through it very, very quickly. So she moved out. She went to a cheaper hotel, and then went to a cheaper hotel, and then went to a cheaper hotel, and finally ended up in a 1-room apartment with 4 other girls. But, she ate, I will say that. Finally, she got a break. She had an audition. She was hired to sing on a commercial with Frank Sinatra. Unfortunately, they just didn't like one another at all, and there was an antagonism between them. She seems to, from what I've seen, gotten along with everyone except Frank Sinatra. But anyway, there was a man named Martin Bloch who came up with some jingles and things, commercial stuff, that I think some of you might remember. Do you remember what ABC stood for? Always by Chesterfield.
Always by Chesterfield.
And how about LSMFT?
Fine tobacco.
Exactly. And he was impressed with her, and he wanted to call her back. And he said, you know, that Dinah girl. From that point on, not only did she change her name, but she began to change her look. Up until then, she had been wearing bobby socks and loafers, saddle shoes, Sloppy Joe sweaters, and so forth. And she was in New York, and she was beginning to absorb the fact that she wasn't very sophisticated at all. And so she started to change that. She went to parties, but she didn't drink at all. And so she would always have to find a plant to pour it into, because people were always giving her things to drink. Meanwhile, she was still trying to earn some money. I'm still trying to live on that $273. She auditioned for Tommy Dorsey, and she was wearing the wrong clothes at that particular moment. She didn't make it, and that's when she decided, I'm going to change my image. So the next person she auditioned for was Benny Goodman, and he was eating a pastrami sandwich during during her audition. And he was also under a lot of pressure for that evening's show, and it simply didn't work out. She was down to her last dollar. She went to her house, borrowed a nickel, and called her father and said, okay, I'll come home. Well, Bessie was in the background. Send her $50, let her try. Well, that happened. And she had another opportunity with Frank Sinatra. And again, it didn't work. It was for a New Jersey furniture company, and they wanted someone with a New Jersey accent, not something from Nashville. And she just didn't convince them, nor did Frank Sinatra. So they both got let go. So what's going to happen to poor Dinah? Here she is in New York, very little money. In January of 1939, she got a position with Leo Reisman's orchestra, appearing at the Strand Theater in Brooklyn. And of course, that was a name band. Happy Days Are Here Again. She was earning $75 a week, and her father came to hear her. He felt justified now that the $50 had worked. Well, she then moved on to make her first record with Xavier Cugat. He thought her name was Dinah Shaw, S-H-A-W, but that got changed very quickly. And she started making some records with him, and guess who was buying up all the records? Her father. At this point. But she also got an agent, and her agent said, you must be Dinah from now on. She began to get radio engagements and began with records and appearances, and she got a contract with Eddie Cantor, and he was a wonderful mentor to her. He told her, sing like you're singing to that person in the audience, a kind of musical intimacy that he himself had. Now, in order to qualify for being on his program, she had to learn 20 new songs every week and have to sing them for him, and then he would choose one. And so she was doing a lot of work, but was beginning to get very good at it. And then came Yes, My Darling Daughter, which just broke all kinds of records. However, it was an ASCAP song, and it could not be played on the radio. It sold 500,000 copies as a little platter. But this was also the age of the jukebox. How many of you remember the jukebox?
Oh, yeah.
In the diners, and putting your money in and turning those pages, remember that?
Yeah.
Well, she was on the road to discovery then. By 1941, she was voted the best girl vocalist in America, and she had learned to sing like Cantor exhorted her to sing. Sing as if you're singing to that person. In 1942, she came to Nashville. By this time, Nashville was totally taken with their hometown girl. And she appeared at the Ryman Auditorium. You can see it's absolutely filled there. She was supposed to appear that evening with Alvin York, but he was sick, so it turned out to be her evening. And she got up in front at the microphone. She couldn't sing a word. She was just so emotionally overwhelmed by it all. She burst into tears, and then she took a few minutes and got herself together and belted out song after song and raised $378,500. Pardon? That was a lot of money in 1942. Okay, she goes back to New York, and she's working nights. Well, during the day, she goes to the movies, and she finds a movie that particularly attracts her. It's got a man in it named George Montgomery. George Montgomery was really George Letts. He was the 15th of 15 children born to a Crimean family that lived in Brady, Montana. And he had grown up in farm life. He knew how to do all sorts of woodworking and cow punching and so forth. And the only recreation the family had was the occasional movie. And he decided he loved movies and wanted to be in them. So he moved to LA during the Depression. He was handsome, he was muscular from all that farm work, he was 6'3", and he was a gentle man, both gentleman and gentle man. For a while he was a barkeep in Los Angeles, and then he got a job as a Cossack cavalryman in a Greta Garbo film. And then he got a big job. He became the stunt man for the Lone Ranger. Remember that? I think we all remember that, Hi-O Silver and so forth. And he changed his name from Letts to Montgomery around that time. He's going to parties because he's becoming known. And he meets Hedy Lamarr. And they become engaged after a period of time. Well, Dinah's back in New Jersey, New York, going to movies during the day, and she saw that movie again and again and again. And she had made up her mind, I'm going to marry that man. But she's on the opposite coast. So what's going to happen? She got her first motion picture deals, and so she ends up going to Los Angeles. She manages to meet him, and he becomes unengaged to Hedy Lamarr, which was probably good for him, and because she has a classic story of her own. She starts seeing him regularly, but the war's on, and he gets sent to Alaska. He sends her a proposal by Victory Mail, and she didn't get it. So he got leave, and he came back to Los Angeles, and the two of them got in her car. She was buying a car had bought a car at that time, and they drove to Las Vegas and got married at 3 a.m. in the morning. And then he was shipped to San Antonio, and guess which division of the service he was in? Making motion pictures. So the two of them are doing all right. Dinah is incredibly popular at this point. As I said, she could not handle money. She was making over $100,000 a year in 1942, 1943. That's tremendous money. And she was only getting about 10% of it. Well, her brother-in-law, Dr. Seligman, hired lawyers to watch over her, and she began to concentrate on other things like her appearance. She was still wearing a pompadour at this time, but she was in film, and the experts there said, get rid of that pompadour, which was like Ginger Rogers, and they restyled her hair, and they bleached it honey blonde. They made up her eyes with eyeliner. They tweezed her eyebrows. They lightened her makeup and made it, dusted her face so she didn't look terribly made up. And they did plastic surgery on her nose. And they filled the gap in her teeth. She didn't consider herself attractive at all. But I will say this, she kept her body in absolute perfect shape. She was 5'6" and 110 pounds and never let any weight get on her at all. And she was warm and outgoing and people liked her, and she was beautiful at this point. She became the featured singer on the Paul Whiteman Presents show. And then, as I said, her movie career began to explode. She was in the first movie, Thank Your Lucky Stars. And then Sam Goldwyn put her in Up in Arms with Danny Kaye about a group of servicemen on a troop ship with a whole lot of nurses, and she was one of the nurses. The next movie was Follow the Boys. And in this one, she sings a song that becomes very, very popular. At this point, the movies were more or less formulaic. They were to entertain the troops, and so they had lots of singing and dancing, and Dinah did well rather, in these sorts of environments, but she never really learned to act at all. And she was beginning to feel, well, this is not really what I need to be doing. But anyway, she was meeting lots of interesting people. She was in movies with W.C. Fields, Orson Welles, Marlene Dietrich, Gypsy Rose Lee in this movie. But like I said, she wasn't particularly good. What she was good at was entertaining the troops. She was the first woman entertainer to go to Europe, and what basically amounted to the USO, entertaining the troops and singing. She sang so much that Bob Hope said, it's the first time I've ever seen a jukebox on legs. And she would sing, just sing her heart out to these soldiers. And in one day, she sang 157 songs. And she lived like the men did. She ate K rations, and she was right up on the front many, many, many times. She never missed a performance. She sang in the rain. She sang in the snow. She performed on the back of a 10-ton truck. And she could memorize names. Remember I told you she developed this skill, the memory skills, and she would memorize the names of soldiers. They loved her. When they captured a bridge, they called it after her. They called it the Dinah Shore Bridge. It was in France. Bob Hope was still amazed at her every time. He would say, Benzedrine takes Dinah Shore to stay awake. Dinah Shore's been sent to more bases than chipped beef. She, like I said, she was just a dynamo in Europe. She also, and I don't know if you remember, I mentioned she was in the German club and she had taken German. She made German broadcasts, sort of Gypsy Rose Lee kind of broadcasts from the American side. And like I said, she was rubbing shoulders with important and famous people, Bing Crosby, Fred Astaire. She also got to meet generals like General George Patton she had dinner with, Omar Bradley, and she was right there in the buzz of all the battle. There's one story about her I saw in the American Stars and Stripes paper about a sniper that was up in a tree, and he was with his gun. It's toward the end of the war, the very end of the war. It was in Garmisch-Partenkirchen in the south of Germany, and she's standing on the back of a truck and she's singing to the soldiers, and the sniper, rather than shooting, starts waving his handkerchief. He wanted to come down and listen to her on ground level and be taken prisoner by the Americans, not by the Russians who were moving in. They certainly didn't want that. So she had quite an effect. Well, at the end of the war, toward the end of the war, she came back to Nashville and then went back to California, where her husband was. Her career really is on a roll at this point, but she is very concerned that when she's at home, she is Mrs. Montgomery. She's not Miss Shore. And if anybody called, the help was instructed, if they asked for Mrs. Montgomery, for Miss Shore, that she was not available at all. The Montgomerys were a hot new Hollywood couple. Remember those paper dolls that had the little clip things that you pasted down, or not pasted, but clipped down? They were cutout dolls. They had a whole book of George and Dinah paper dolls. And she made her last movie. And like I said, they were all kind of fair to middling, and she was beginning to realize that this was not for her. She made one more attempt. She wanted to part in Showboat, but it didn't happen. Ava Gardner got it, so she walked away from movies altogether. And then came another song, which was a huge, big song. They're living comfortably now. He's still doing some movies, and he's also running a furniture business where he's making basically reproductions, and she's bringing in money, and they're living very, very well. But along comes a child, Melissa, in 1948, and it sort of changed things in their life. And the same kind of imbalances that existed in her parents' marriage tended to be in her marriage. The ages were closer together. In fact, they were the same age, but the way they handled money was quite different. And Dinah never learned to handle money at all. And George was very serious about it. He had really grown up in a hardscrabble situation. Well, she starts a television career at this time, and she realized from the very beginning that television would be her medium, not the big screen, the big silver screen, but where she was a smaller, engaging entertainer and could be in the room with her viewers, and she loved it. And she started out on the Ed Wynn show. And then along came the biggie, which I think you probably all remember, if I'm going to be able to get this now. Well, things were going well. She was selling millions of Chevrolets. That couldn't be happier, her sponsors, Chevrolet. But the network wasn't happy. She wasn't winning ratings against Ronald Reagan. And so she got dumped after a while. It all comes down to money. But at this point, she's one of the 10 most admired women in the world. But there were problems at home. Melissa, the child, her natural child, wanted a sibling. And Dinah, for whatever reasons, was more inclined to adopt. And so they adopted a boy named John David and called him Jody. And there were still problems. There were problems between her and her husband. He was busy with some movies. They were sort of B-rated movies. And he was in the Philippines with an Israeli actress cutting a film, and he apparently had an affair with her, and things just didn't go well, and so the couple got divorced in 1962 after being married 18 years and 2 children. In the end, Dinah said, we just drifted apart, but insiders knew that it was the affair that he had had. It did not cause him to fall away from Dinah. He still supported her in terms of encouragement and so forth. They had a reasonable relationship. George Montgomery got involved with another woman. It was kind of a Steve McNair affair. He had another girlfriend too, and the first girlfriend came and tried to shoot him. But he was bigger than she, and he was able to wrestle the gun out of her hand, so it was a lot of negative publicity all the way around. Meanwhile, she has taken up tennis with a passion, and she's playing with Maurice Smith. And she's divorced at this time, and they decide to get married. It lasted about as long as a tennis match. It was not a good marriage at all. He was an extremely wealthy contractor who had plenty of time to play tennis, but the marriage just was not good. She moved to Palm Springs with the kids and played tennis and golf, and she got interested in the fact, because this is also the period of women's lib, she got interested in the fact that women golfers were not paid near what men golfers got, like 1/6 of what the men got. And she also was annoyed that she could not directly join a country club because she was a woman. I think that still pertains here at the Belmead Country Club, does it not, where they can become a lady member or something, but they can't join on their own. Anyway, she was interested in the inequities in golf, and so she got Colgate to sponsor the Dinah Shore tournament, and eventually it became a event every year. Anyway, she had other hobbies too. She took up her art again, and she had several different shows, including a cooking, a succession of cookbooks, and she did a lot of cooking on her shows. She had several different shows and was taken by different networks too along the way. But she always had a welcoming, this is my home and I'm inviting you into it kind of approach. She was the original Oprah. And interestingly, both of them had Nashville roots. And most of you probably remember Oprah on Channel 5. Reading the news, she always did it well. And anyway, Dinah did the same sort of thing. She was terrific on the air, and she had wonderful guests who came. For instance, Spiro Agnew, who played tennis with her and hit her straight in the eye with the ball, and she had a big black eye for days on air and couldn't be on TV. She had Ethel Kennedy, who came and played the piano, and Frank Sinatra, because they cooked together, even if they couldn't sing well together. And then she also had Burt Reynolds. And he had played in Deliverance. He had done a nude male centerfold. He was quite an edgy person at this time. He was also 20 years younger than Dinah. And as I said to someone earlier, I never even knew the word cougar. I don't watch TV much, so I didn't even know that there was a program about cougars. But anyway, she was the original, well, not the original, but she was a cougar, and was with him for many, many, many years. In fact, I remember when they came here to Nashville, they stayed with Buddy Killen, and they had a piece in the Tennessean that the two of them were seen on a motorcycle in Donaldson. And I thought, well, she's a pretty brave woman. And she did keep up her contacts with her family here. The Shirley Zeitlin that you see on the end is not the Shirley Zeitlin of real estate fame. This is a girl whose last name was Zeitlin. The Shirley Zeitlin that we all know married into the family. She also was with a cousin who had married into the Bittner family, the Rubensteins. And this, my husband will like, because the man on the right is a friend of his, a state trooper. She came and she sang at the Belmead Country Club here in Nashville. and she had an escort. And like I said, my husband's friend escorted her. She was probably one of the first Jews to go to the Belmead Country Club, because that was not on their guest list at all. Every once in a while I would hear of a young person who had been invited maybe to a birthday party there, and if they found out that they were Jewish, they were asked to leave. Because, you know, in Franklin they had signs like "No Jews or dogs." But anyway, she went to the Belmead Country Club, and things worked out. They accepted her, and she was friends with all sorts of people, including President Ford. So she had a wonderful career, rubbing shoulders with some of the greats of her time. And when she died of ovarian cancer in 1994, President Ford said, "Betty and I have lost a very dear friend, one of the finest, most generous, and thoughtful persons we have been privileged to know. Dinah was 5-star in every way." She's buried in 2 places. She was cremated, and she was buried at the Hillside Memorial Park Cemetery in Culver City, and at the Forest Lawn Cemetery in Cathedral City. And upon her death, her ex-husband, George Montgomery, designed and created a bronze sculpture from their favorite family portrait. And the statue still stands there, a tribute to Dinah and an incredible career. It's not bad for a Jewish girl from Nashville, eh?
Not bad at all.
You got any questions?
Gene, why don't you mention your new book and the fact that you're going to be talking about it Friday at the Bellevue YMCA 50 Forward?
You know, I'm very brazen. I brought this because some of you know you're independent publishers, and you know what happens when you have all these books and you have to sell them. So I'm retelling a story, as historical fiction, of 2 Jewish brothers who lived in Black Bottom in the first 4 streets from the river to 4th, which was Cherry back then. And I know you have helped me, Leanne, with finding information and so forth. I based this story on fact. It turns out that these 2 brothers had interesting involvement in Nashville life in the 1880s. This brother was in love with the stepsister, and the stepsister is ravishing. Her name is Rosa, but the problem is Rosa's married, and she has a couple of kids. But her husband can be disposed of, so says this guy. So he gives a black man $50 to take an axe and chop up Rosa's husband. This is 8 years before Lizzie Borden, so we Nashvillians were ahead on axe murders. And he's the one that goes to prison as being an accessory before the fact. The black man escapes, runs away, is caught 6 months later in the bayou in Louisiana. He's brought back, he's tried, and he eventually goes free. I won't tell you why, because that's in the book. And then, meanwhile, there's a crazy brother, a manic brother, who records it all. And what happened is, as I was researching on other things, I came across this book at the Tennessee State Library called Fighting Against Fate. And it's a story of 2 brothers. And I started looking at it. It had beautiful pictures for a book published in 1900. And I thought, this is crazy. This is fiction. What's it doing here? And so I went up to the librarian and I said, is this fiction? and she said, "We are not a lending library." And so when I had finished with what I was doing, maybe a year or so more later, I decided to research with newspapers the whole story, and that's what I have incorporated in this book, which my husband, I think there's one floating around, oh, right there, right here. And I've got a lot of pictures in it because the crazy brother had all kinds of pictures. He spent $5,000 in 1900 publishing the book. So you know these are beautiful pictures. Do you remember the books that we used to have that had a protective page over the picture? Some of these pictures have protective pages, but the point is they're beautiful pictures. And so it's richly illustrated. Of course, I can't find one now, but they're there. And it shows a lot of the figures of the time. Judge Allen, who conducted the trial, and just...
Not my relative.
Not your relative. But anyway, this is my book, Barney and Clyde, an illustrated tale of murder and madness. And thank you for coming.